Hey, everybody. This week, the U.S. Department of Education went from 4,100 employees to 2,200, shrinking it in half. This is not a minor deal. This is a major deal. The U.S. Department of Education is responsible for managing nearly 20 federal programs and more than $200 billion with a B and funding to states, school districts, colleges, you name it. What happens next will no doubt have considerable implications on public education in America. My name is Monica Maybank, and this is the Holy Politician Podcast. On this podcast, we discuss politics, policy, and culture through the lens of truth and holiness. If you haven't subscribed, I would encourage you to do that right now and share this podcast with three of your closest friends. So, the Department of Education, as I discussed a few podcasts ago, is the smallest agency of all federal agencies. And so it's the largest is the Department of Veterans Affairs with nearly 500,000 employees. Education has 4,000. So just consider that in terms of scale and impact on the federal budget. It's minimal. So the point in the president wanting to downsize the Department of Education is simple. It's to return education back to the states, not to save money for efficiency purposes. And this is something that Republicans have been talking about, as I've said before, since Ronald Reagan was president. They want education to belong to the states, for states to take ownership of it, for states to drive their own academic performance and student achievement, creating their own rules, yada, yada, yada. Education is not in the federal United States Constitution. However, there are lots of things that are not in the Constitution that the federal government manages. This is one of those priority areas for Republicans. And so, for additional context, just to set the stage on what is the Department of Education, what are they responsible for? I want to share with you the five major education laws that they govern. The first is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as ESEA. And this is like the major public education law that governs what happens in K-12 schools. So that's everything from preschool all the way to high school. And most of this law supports disadvantaged students in these schools, as well as school improvement efforts. Some of you may have heard of Title I schools. Well, Title I is a specific part of this law that supports low performing schools within the statute or law. And so if you're a school that has low academic performance year after year after year, and if you have a large proportion of students that are low income, you are a Title I school. And this act also supports things like free and reduced student lunch. It supports after school programs. And so this money and the humans who manage this money under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act are affected by the cuts that are being implemented within the Department of Education. There's also the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which provides special education services and funding for students with disabilities. And so this includes funding for parents who might not be getting the right care that they need for their student, for example, who might be on the spectrum. They might not be getting the right care in one school. They can remove their child from that school and take them and their funding to another school that's going to do right by their kid. And so IDEA is something that many, many students rely on as it concerns the regulations, the policies, the accountability mechanisms in there to protect students with disabilities. The Higher Education Act, if you've ever gone to college, this concerns you. This governs student financial aid programs like the Pell Grant, which is free money if you're in college and if you are eligible, as well as federal student loans. And so y'all know what it is. Any student who's ever gone to college knows that the Pell Grant is helpful and important. And for some people, student loans are important to be able to graduate from college. And so the Higher Education Act is one of the major laws or statutes that come out of the Department of Education. The Career and Technical Education Act is one that I'm very familiar with. I lobbied on this law when I was a lobbyist. And these are funds for vocational and technical education programs. And so anything that's career and technical ed in high school and community college, like cosmetology programs, lots of health sciences programs, construction programs, agricultural programs, things that teach students a trade while they're in high school and connects it meaningfully to a career after high school. A lot of this funding comes through the Career in Technical Education, or the Carl D. Perkins Career in Technical Education Act. And then finally, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, which supports education for adults looking for basic literacy or English proficiency. So just think adult school or night school, students that are maybe learning English or need additional support as it concerns English. And so these are the major laws that are managed out of the Department of Education. But again, we're talking billions and billions of dollars amongst 20 federal programs out of these main five education laws. And so another thing that the Education Department is responsible for overseeing, which is really key and paramount, which they recently just fired a lot of civil rights attorneys, are civil rights protections and privacy protections. There are titles such as Title VI, Title IX, something called ADA, it's Section 504. All of this protects students against discrimination based on race, based on sex, based on disability, and based on age. And without these protections, states might be going off the rails. Who knows? We know that this happened in the past. We know that it continues to happen, which is why these protections are in place. And that's why there are attorneys that have been working for years out of the Department of Education to protect students in these cases of discrimination. And then there's FERPA, which you've probably heard about. It ensures that parents and students have rights over their own education records and that there's privacy in their records. And so the Education Department manages a lot of programs, but they also manage a lot of protections and privacy concerns in education that states either weren't doing, or maybe the federal government felt that states weren't doing a good job at. One interesting thing to note is that Howard University, which is my alma mater, is also funded under federal statute through the U.S. Department of Education. Howard University receives nearly $300 million a year to support its educational programs. And this is in large part to the way that Howard University was founded in 1867. It's a historically Black university in D.C., and it has direct ties to Congress, which was basically during its birth, it was created out of that kind of that legal connection. There are also lots of HBCUs that are supported under the Department of Education and its funding. And these HBCUs rely on that funding to support their programs and to be able to create an opportunity for Black kids and other underrepresented students to get educated. So closing down the U.S. Department of Education is not a small thing, and it's something that I care deeply about. Most of my advocacy career was as an education advocate. My parents were both teachers, and I knew that I didn't have the anointing to be a teacher, but I admired their ability to be teachers, that they worked long hours and they took on lots of challenges that students presented themselves with in class, right? There's so many things that teachers are. They're moms, they're dads. I mean, to these kids, right? They are ministers to these kids. They're social workers. They are big sisters, everything. Teachers don't get enough credit. So if you're a teacher, I tip my hat off to you because I know how much work that involves. But I would see how my parents were impacting these students' lives, particularly when they were teaching in Compton, California. And I also saw how one of my best friends from high school teaches in Compton, California. And she is a champion for those students who are mostly Black and Mexican, right? So these are kids that have had a hard time in life, a lot of them, because they have lived either in poverty or close to the poverty line. They've been exposed to lots of traumatic experiences just based on their upbringing and their environment. So as a lobbyist, I advocated for these students, those who grew up in hoods, who everybody ignored. And so oftentimes these students are pejoratively referred to as other people's children, when in reality, they're not other people's children. They're America's children. They're God's children. And so it makes it really hard for me to wrap my head around the significant lack of empathy and understanding and the gravity of what is happening right now in the Department of Education, how it's going to affect kids when I see clips like this.
Joining me now, Department of Education Secretary Linda McMahon. Madam Secretary, great to have you in studio today. All right. First, welcome to the show, because you haven't been on in studio with me before. Now, is this the first step on the road to a total shutdown?
Yes, actually it is, because that was the president's mandate, this directive to me. clearly is to shut down the Department of Education, which we know we'll have to work with Congress, to get that accomplished. But what we did today was to take the first step of eliminating what I think is bureaucratic bloat. And that's not to say that a lot of the folks, it's a humanitarian thing too. A lot of the folks that are there, they're out of a job. But we wanted to make sure that we kept all of the right people and the good people to make sure that the outward-facing programs, the grants, the appropriations that come from Congress, all of that are being met. And none of that's going to fall through the cracks.
So that was my next question. So the criteria for keeping that 50% is related to expenditures and key programs?
Correct. Congress appropriates the money that is going through Title I to IDEA programs.
What's that stand for?
Do you know what? I'm not sure I can tell you exactly what it stands for, except that it's the Programs for Disabled and Needs.
Individuals with Disabilities Act, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm guessing. I don't know. I don't know all my acronyms. I've been here for 30 years.
This is my fifth day on the job, and I'm really trying to learn them very quickly.
The current Secretary of Education has been on the job for 5 whole entire days. How do you make an accurate assessment of who needs to go and what the implications will be on children in 5 days? I just don't know how you're able to really determine and measure the degree to which certain programs and certain cuts within certain departments are going to have an effect on everyday children in 5 days, which leads me to believe that she likely walked into her office and her seat with an instruction manual and a blueprint on how to do it, because it's hard to make that judgment within 5 days. And then what do we mean by keeping all of the right people and good people? And so it's important for us, even though a lot of this is frustrating, to really think about, well, what is really happening that we cannot see? And so there are a few important things to know about what these changes at the Department of Education might mean for students. And I know these things and understand them because I'm speaking from experience of actually writing policy language for the Department of Education that became federal law, meeting with representatives and their staff, negotiating what is best for children, sitting at the table with both the Obama and the Trump administration's chief education people. And so it's important for us to understand that there's lots that's not being said when you're looking at media clips or when you're reading a news article or reading social media. The first thing to note is that just because the Department of Education is shrinking and maybe eventually closing, it doesn't mean that these programs and the funding automatically goes away. First, what is in statute or law must be accomplished because it's the law. The federal government knows that states need this money, and yet they tell the states what to do because it's law. But states are like, well, if you want us to perform this law, show us the money. But on top of that, you've got this idea, which could happen, that even though they're getting rid of the Department of Ed, some of the management of their programs is going to go to other agencies. Who those agencies are yet, we don't know. But just because it's shrinking doesn't mean that these programs and this funding goes away. What will likely change is that there will probably not be any regulations or very minimal regulations and guidance for states as to how to execute these laws. If you've ever looked at legislation, and I would encourage you to do so, I think it's congress.gov or something you can go to, look at a piece of legislation. It looks like Chinese if you're reading it for the first time. Unless you've practiced law, you've gone to law school, most people do not know how to read legislation. And so because of that, your everyday person that works at a state department of education or who works inside of a school district, they don't know or understand what this law is saying. And so there are regulations and there is guidance and rules that are created to help explain legislation, but also to add prescriptive rules to that legislation. Well, Republicans don't really like regulations because they're too prescriptive and too restrictive. Regulations are basically a list of rules on how things must be done that the law says, but there's a lot more color, there's dye, there's all kinds of things that's added to the actual statute. It's like micromanaging. If you hire someone for a role, you give them the job description, and yet you're giving them all of these things on top of the job description and other duties as assigned, right? And you're hovering over their shoulder to make sure that they do it the way you want them to do it. You want to know the play-by-play. Well, that's basically what regulations are. It's like the federal government peering over the shoulder of states and school districts, bearing down on them, telling them exactly how to do, what to do, when lots of states are saying, we know our kids better than you. School districts are saying, we definitely know our kids better than you. Stop telling us what to do and how to do it. Just give us the money. So even though a lot of the cuts are happening, law still requires that these things happen. Okay. Now, whether or not these laws, which expire for the most part every 6 years, are going to continue to be funded is another story entirely. I think some of the programs probably won't be funded or won't be funded to the extent that they've been funded because I did say $200 billion is spent on education. The second thing to know, and the important thing that is that many of these laws and regulations were put in place to protect vulnerable students. When I say vulnerable students, I mean students with disabilities and underrepresented racial and ethnic groups like Black and Mexican students in Compton, California. Things that ensure that they get a hot meal every day, ensuring that they're not labeled disruptive or disabled just because they're Black or Mexican, which has happened significantly throughout the years, ensuring that their academic performance is accounted for and that they see how each student group is performing, ensuring that students who don't have the means get access to funding for college. And so important stuff like that that is at risk and potentially being jeopardized. And so most, if not all of us, have benefited from what comes out of the Department of Education. And so although this is a bit concerning to me, I understand the arguments raised that student proficiency sucks and it hasn't really improved much, if at all. So why do we have these rules and these programs and these regulations in place at the federal level if nothing is really changing? And I get it. That's a fair and valid argument. We can't keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So something does need to change. And as a society, we need to rely less and less on government solutions and focus more on God solutions. What is the God solution for this problem? That's the question that we should pose to every challenge that we face in government, out of government, in our homes, outside of our homes. What is the God solution? So, with more than 20 federal programs at stake that serve 50 million children across 100,000 K-12 schools, and nearly 16 million students, 16, and 6,000 colleges and universities, maybe the answer is what? It's whatever God says the answer is. And so keep praying. Ask God, what is the right solution? Education is one of the most basic fundamental needs that people have in America is to get a quality education, to be given the right access to opportunities, not to be discriminated against because of bias of their disability or their race or their income. And so let's pray that as states get the power back and districts get the power back, that they do the right thing for all of God's children. Thank you for watching. Take care.